USS Monitor was commissioned in early 1862 for the United States Navy as an experimental type of warship using a rotating gun turret, and it is the first ship with such a feature to see action, and ultimately, due to its success in battle, the Monitor-type Ironclad began popping up all around the globe. Monitor is the first in its class for many respects. It's the first one built, the first one commissioned, the first one to see service, and it's also the first one to sink on December 31st, 1862 during a storm off Cape Hatteras, which is off the North Carolina coast. Now, the Monitor-type Ironclad was vulnerable to heavy waters and the deep ocean, though it could withstand such forces for extended periods of time. In Monitor's case, it survived the storm with flooding for about 7 hours, while it was in the storm for approximately 24 hours. However, the ship did ultimately founder due to various flaws in the design when it comes to deep water service. During the course of the Civil War, the United States government would order 60 Monitor-type ironclads of various designs to be constructed. 37 would be completed before the war came to a conclusion, and of this 37, 6, including Monitor, were lost. Excluding Monitor, much is not known about the other 5 that were lost, so we're going to explore the other 5 vessels that were sunk during the war today. The first 2 we are going to look at are 2 Passaic-class Monitors, of which 10 vessels to this design were completed during the war. Now, as far as I'm aware, there are no good surviving photographs of these 2 vessels, so this is what a Passaic-type Monitor looks like. It's basically the USS Monitor, but slightly larger. For the rest of the images, they are simply going to be artist impressions of the time period, and the first vessel is the USS Weehawken. Weehawken is the only Monitor we're going to look at today that was not sunk during battle. The vessel was actually anchored at Morris Island on December 6, 1863, after receiving a fresh supply of resources, which included ammunition, and all of these supplies were simply being stored in the forward portion of the ship, awaiting to be dispersed. The ship's trim tanks had also not been adjusted for the increase of mass within the ship, so the ship was sitting down at the bow when a sudden storm popped up, and though this storm was not strong enough to take a Monitor down, Weehawken signaled for distress, and within 5 minutes, the vessel had sunk. A significant error in the design of these early Monitor types, especially ones that John Erickson had designed, was the location of the hawse pipe, which normally just sat a couple inches above the waterline. However, due to the fact that Weehawken's bow was down, as the waves pushed up on the ship and it began bobbing up and down, the hawse pipe submerged and water freely flooded in the bow of the ship and took it down with ease. Over a period of time, it became apparent the hawse pipe was a serious threat to the design of the Monitor-type vessel when it came to storms, so newer designs began deleting the anchor well altogether and just storing the anchor on deck, while Monitors that had the anchor well had them closed off and the anchor stored on deck when time was given to make this adjustment. Due to the rather busy location Weehawken sank in, its wreck was razed following the Civil War and was broken up. Moving on to the next vessel, the other Passaic that was lost during the war was the USS Patapsco. During the night of January 15th and 16th, 1865, the Patapsco was escorting a series of minesweepers between Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie, which were clearing up the torpedoes that the Confederates had laid in the area to sink Union warships. While running its course through a torpedo field, the Patapsco accidentally struck one of the torpedoes itself and sank. Though the numbers heavily vary for this instance, between 60 to 80 of the Patapsco's crew were killed in the sinking. Unlike the Weehawken, the Patapsco's wreck has not been recovered and still resides where she sank to this day. As far as I'm aware, no expeditions have gone down to this wreck. However, a series of scans have been produced of its final resting place. Up next is a very special Monitor that was lost. This is the USS Milwaukee, the only double-turreted Monitor to be lost during the war. Unlike the bulk of the ships that we are looking at today, the Milwaukee was not designed by John Erickson, but instead by one of his leading competitors, James Eads, whom had also designed his own type of rotating gun turret, for which one turret on this vessel is of Eads' design, while the other turret is Erickson's design. On March 28, 1865, Milwaukee was a part of Admiral Farragut's fleet attacking the city of Mobile Bay, which is located in the state of Alabama. Now, this is not to be confused with the Battle of Mobile Bay itself, which had been concluded the previous year with a Union victory. The difference here is the Battle of Mobile Bay secured the bay itself for the Union fleet, while this attack is to secure the city. Now, the story behind Milwaukee's loss is very scarce, and when you find the information, it contradicts one another in a series of aspects. However, when you tie all the knots together, you get quite a clear image, so this is essentially what happened. On the Blakely River, a Confederate transport was spotted. Milwaukee and her sister ship, Winnebago, detached from the main body to attack the transport. However, the transport, seeing these monitors coming for it, turned around and retreated back up the river. The two monitors, being slower, decided not to pursue and returned to the main fleet and continue their bombardment on Spanish Fort. The two monitors came within 200 yards of Spanish Fort when Milwaukee suddenly struck a Confederate-laid torpedo. The stern of the ship broke off and sank in 3 minutes, with the bow of the ship taking approximately 1 hour to sink. All sources that I have read say that no lives were lost. As for the wreck of Milwaukee, it, much like Weehawken, was recovered following the Civil War and broken up. In recent decades, the famous author Clive Cussler led an expedition to confirm the fact that Milwaukee and the next monitor we are going to discuss were in fact both razed and broken up, and during this expedition, he did not find traces of either monitor. There are a series of explanations as to why this is. However, the two main conclusions that can be drawn are that the wrecks were completely razed and broken up, or if there are minor components of the wrecks left behind, we cannot see them. And this leads us directly into the next monitor, which is the Osage. Now, Osage is not like the other monitors on this list. It is a river monitor, not a coastal monitor. This means its draft is about half of the other monitors, which allows it to traverse the shallow waters of the Mississippi River, and its propulsion system is not propellers, but rather paddle wheels. The story for the Osage is almost identical to Milwaukee, except it happens on the next day. On March 29, 1865, Osage was participating in the bombardment of Spanish Fort, which has yet to conclude, and while traversing the area around the fort, it struck a Confederate torpedo and subsequently sank. The Osage sank in a couple of minutes, killing only 2 of her crew, while a few others were wounded, yet would survive. As I had already touched on in the Milwaukee section, the Osage's wreck was razed along with Milwaukee's and was broken up, and Clive Cussler had attempted to confirm that these wrecks were indeed razed when he found nothing of them, thus concluding that they were indeed razed. The next and final monitor we are going to discuss today is the Canonicus-class monitor Tecumseh. Now, the Tecumseh, unlike the other 4 that we had already talked about, has some extreme details that go into its sinking, and next to Monitor itself is the most complete story. On the 5th of August, 1864, the battle for Mobile Bay was about to commence. This is the battle for the bay itself and not the city, and Admiral Farragut had the Tecumseh leading the line of monitors, and at about 6:30 a.m. that morning, Tecumseh opened fire, giving the Union fleet ranging shots. Before long, the Battle of Mobile Bay escalated quickly and became one of the most intense naval engagements of the American Civil War, with a humongous Union fleet engaging a pretty healthy-sized Confederate fleet, which also had ironclads at its disposal, and a series of Confederate land forts. Bringing focus back to the Tecumseh, the vessel by 7:30 a.m. had made great progress. Still in front of the Monitor line, it was between Fort Morgan and a Confederate minefield, which the vessel was unaware of. Behind Tecumseh was the frigate Brooklyn, which had suddenly stopped, and Admiral Farragut plus Tecumseh were both confused as to why Brooklyn had stopped. It appears that it had noticed the minefield. However, Tecumseh had turned its attention to the Confederate ironclad Tennessee, which was less than 1,000 yards away from it, on the other side of the minefield. Tecumseh, looking for a good fight, turned towards the Tennessee and unwittingly entered the minefield, And before long, a humongous column of water ripped up from under the ship's bow. The column of water was caused by a torpedo which had struck the vessel on the starboard side, quickly lifting the starboard side up and throwing the Monitor over onto its port side before it settled back down on an even keel. However, there was a humongous gaping hole in the starboard bow, and Tecumseh sank within a couple of minutes, taking most of her crew to the bottom of Mobile Bay with her. Unlike the preceding Monitors on this list, Tecumseh is much like the USS Monitor itself. It has not been raised, and it has seen a series of expeditions, which leads us to understand how the wreck is currently residing, and, much like Monitor itself, it is upside down with the dislodged turret located under the hull. Over the last 5 or so decades, a series of ideas had popped up about recovering the Tecumseh's wreck in its entirety and then preserving it, much like we can kind of see with the USS Monitor today. However, a lot of issues did come up with this regarding money, conservation, whom would perform this task, who would own the ship, and of course, the extensive amount of dead crewmen whom are still within the ship. It was decided legally that Tecumseh's wreck may not be raised, however, it will be preserved in the state that it is currently in, and preservation efforts are going on to this very day. Well, hopefully you have learned something new about Civil War era monitors. If so, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.